Magician Horror Stories. It was a misty autumn evening in the quiet town of Blackwood Pines, the kind of night where the air carried a hint of mystery, wrapping around you like a secret waiting to be uncovered. The town had a new buzz, a traveling magician named Elias Crowley. He had chosen an abandoned opera house as the venue for his show. The opera house, an eerie structure with peeling paint and a crumbling facade, stood at the edge of town. People avoided it, whispering of curses and strange happenings. But tonight, it was alive with flickering lights and the soft hum of anticipation. Angela Reed, a local journalist, leaned against the opera house's wooden doors. Her breath was steady, but tinged with curiosity. This isn't just a story, she thought, adjusting her jacket against the crisp night air. It's a chance to finally uncover the truth. Inside, the atmosphere was thick, stifling almost. The audience? Strange. They sat rigid, dressed in outdated attire, their faces pale and emotionless. Angela hesitated, her instincts whispering a warning. Still, she pushed forward, gripping her notepad tighter. The stage lights dimmed suddenly, plunging the room into silence. And then, Elias Crowley stepped out. He didn't walk, he glided, commanding the room with a quiet power. His long coat shimmered under the lights, and his pale blue eyes seemed to pierce the soul of everyone present. "Ladies and gentlemen," his voice was calm but carried an undeniable weight. "Tonight, you will see the impossible." Angela felt a shiver crawl up her spine. There was something unnerving about his presence. The show began with simple tricks, cards appearing out of thin air, doves fluttering from nowhere. But the audience? They barely reacted. It was as if they knew something deeper was coming. Then, Elias unveiled an object hidden behind a deep red curtain, a large antique mirror. Its surface wasn't ordinary. It seemed to ripple, as though it were alive. The ornate frame was engraved with symbols Angela couldn't recognize. "This mirror," Elias began, his voice soft yet commanding, "doesn't just show reflections. It reveals truths. Truths we bury deep within ourselves." Angela froze as his eyes swept the audience and locked onto her. "You," he said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade, "will face the mirror tonight." A collective murmur rippled through the crowd. Angela's pulse quickened. Me? She thought, every instinct screaming at her to refuse. But the intensity of his gaze left her no choice. Slowly, she rose, her steps hesitant but deliberate. The crowd seemed to part as she made her way to the stage. "Stand before it," Elias instructed, his tone softer now, almost coaxing. Angela stood before the mirror. At first, she saw only her reflection, slightly distorted in the shimmering surface. But then, the reflection changed. Her reflection smiled. A cold, unsettling grin that didn't match her own expression. Angela's breath caught. She stumbled back, but the reflection didn't follow. It began to move on its own, stepping out of the mirror and onto the stage. The audience gasped. The air in the room seemed heavier, like gravity itself had intensified. "What is this?" Angela whispered, her voice trembling. Elias's voice was calm, almost indifferent. "It is your shadow self, the part of you you've tried to hide, and now you must face it." The shadow moved closer, its presence cold and suffocating. It whispered to Angela, not with words, but with memories. Her failures, her doubts, her fears, they all came rushing back in vivid, painful detail. "You're not enough," it seemed to say. "You never have been." Angela's knees threatened to buckle. Tears welled in her eyes as the weight of her insecurities bore down on her. "Why?" she cried, her voice cracking. "Why are you doing this?" Elias stepped closer, his tone unyielding. "Because only when you face the darkness within can you find the strength to overcome it." Angela closed her eyes, her mind a whirl of chaos. But then, a voice, faint but steady, her father's voice from years ago. "Angela, you're stronger than you think. Don't let fear win. The memory ignited something within her, a spark. She opened her eyes, her gaze locking with the shadows. "You're a part of me," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "But you don't define me." The shadow hesitated, its form flickering like a dying flame. Angela took a step forward, her voice firmer now. "I see you, I accept you, but you will not control me." With those words, the shadow let out a silent scream, dissolving into the air. The mirror shattered, shards of glass scattering across the stage. Angela stood there, her breath heavy, her heart pounding. The audience erupted into applause, but something about it felt off. Their claps were slow, synchronized, almost robotic. Elias gave her a small bow. "You've done well. Few are so brave." The lights dimmed, and when they came back on, Elias and the mirror were gone. The audience began to vanish, fading into the shadows like smoke. Angela stumbled out of the opera house, the cool night air hitting her like a wave. She felt a mix of relief and dread. The next day she returned, determined to find answers. But the opera house? It was boarded up as though it had been abandoned for decades. No one believed her story, brushing it off as a dream or a fabrication. But Angela knew better. Late that night, as she prepared for bed, her eyes fell on her bathroom mirror. For a brief moment, she swore she saw a flicker, a shadow staring back at her. This is the Magician horror story number 2. There's always a street in every city that feels untouched by time. In ours, it was Willow Lane, a cobblestone stretch with flickering street lamps and shops that seemed to hold their breath, waiting for someone to notice their forgotten stories. Among them was an old theater. Not grand or ostentatious, just quietly there, like an aging sentinel. Its faded sign read, "The Mirage," though the letters had dulled so much you had to squint to make them out. The Mirage had been closed for decades. No one could remember exactly why. Some whispered about the magician who performed his last act there and never returned. Others spoke of strange sounds that echoed from within at night, like the theater itself was trying to perform its own haunted show. Then, one chilly morning, as the city stirred to life, Pippa, an inquisitive journalist with a knack for chasing the unusual, spotted something strange, a flyer. Its crimson lettering stood out against the grayness of the lamppost it clung to. The return of Darius the Enigmatic, one night only. Her pulse quickened. The Mirage. Reopening? And a magician no one had heard of for decades? This wasn't just a story. It was a calling. The night arrived, bringing with it an almost electric stillness. Pippa stood outside the theater, its facade suddenly vibrant, as though time had reversed just for this night. The doors were open, inviting, and a faint golden glow spilled onto the cobblestones. Inside, it was like stepping into another world. Velvet seats, deep red and plush, curved elegantly around a stage framed by gilded curtains. The scent of aged wood and something faintly floral hung in the air, stirring memories she couldn't quite place. The audience was a curious mix. Families, older couples clutching hands, and solitary figures like Pippa, drawn by something unexplainable. As the house lights dimmed, a hush fell over the room. The stage remained empty, but a single spotlight flickered to life. And then, he appeared. A tall figure in a black suit, his top hat tilted just so, stepped into the light. His movements were fluid, deliberate. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice smooth, rich, and familiar, as though it had been plucked from an old memory. "Welcome to an evening of wonder, of mystery, of the impossible." Darius the Enigmatic was everything his name promised. His hands moved like they had minds of their own, pulling cards from thin air and conjuring doves that fluttered into the rafters. Flames leapt from his fingers only to transform into delicate roses that scattered their petals across the stage. The audience was enthralled, and yet, Pippa felt a heaviness beneath the enchantment. Darius's eyes, though warm, carried a shadow, a sadness that seemed to deepen with each act. Occasionally, his gaze flicked toward the crowd, lingering as though searching for someone, or something. She couldn't shake the feeling that every trick, every illusion was layered with meaning, like a riddle she was meant to solve. As the show drew to a close, Darius stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "For my final act," he said, his voice quieter now, "I will attempt something I have never dared before." The room leaned in. "This is the Door of Echoes." He gestured, and a soft, glowing orb appeared, hovering mid-air. Its light pulsed faintly, like a heartbeat. "The door reveals fragments of the past," Darius continued, his tone growing heavier. "Memories lost to time. But be warned, what it shows can never be unseen." The air in the theater grew tense, expectant. The orb began to expand, its light casting a soft glow over the crowd. Within it, shapes started to form, blurry at first, then sharp, vivid. Pippa's breath caught. There she was, as a little girl, sitting at her grandmother's kitchen table. The smell of warm apple pie and cinnamon filled the air, so real she could almost taste it. Her grandmother's laughter rang out, a sound she hadn't heard in years. Around her, the audience murmured. Each person was seeing something different. A wedding day, a childhood friend, a moment they thought was gone forever. It was beautiful, until it wasn't. The images began to flicker, their edges distorting. The orb's light grew harsher, casting shadows that stretched unnaturally across the room. Darius's voice broke through the tension, sharp and urgent. "I need to close it, now!" But the orb didn't respond. Its pulsing quickened, the light turning chaotic. The hum in the theater rose, becoming a deafening roar. Then, with a blinding flash, the orb shattered. The room plunged into darkness. When the lights returned, Darius was gone. The audience sat frozen, unsure whether to clap or scream. Slowly, they began to shuffle out, murmuring about what they'd seen, convincing themselves it was all part of the act. But Pippa knew better. Her instincts told her to stay, even as fear coiled in her chest. She approached the stage, her footsteps echoing in the now empty theater. Something glinted on the floor, a gold pocket watch. Its face was cracked, its hands frozen at midnight. She picked it up. "Pippa!" The whisper made her freeze. Her head snapped up. The stage was empty. "Pippa!" The voice came again, louder this time. It was him. Darius stood at the edge of the stage, his polished suit now disheveled, his face pale and drawn. "You have to help me," he pleaded, his voice trembling. "Help you with what?" she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. Before he could answer, the shadows on the stage began to move. They swirled and thickened, forming a towering figure that seemed to suck the light from the room. Darius's voice dropped to a whisper. "No." It followed me. The figure stepped forward, its presence heavy and suffocating. Pippa felt the air grow colder, her breath visible in the dim light. "Run!" Darius shouted. She didn't wait. Clutching the pocket watch, Pippa bolted for the exit. Shadows slithered along the walls, reaching for her, their touch icy. She pushed through the heavy doors, stumbling onto the street. The theater loomed behind her, silent and dark, as though nothing had happened. She turned, breathless, and caught one final glimpse through the glass. Darius stood on the stage, facing the figure. His eyes met hers, filled with a mix of resignation and hope. Then the doors slammed shut. In the days that followed, Pippa tried to make sense of what she'd seen. The Mirage was boarded up again, as if it had never reopened. The flyers disappeared, and no one from the audience seemed to remember much. But Pippa remembered. At night, in the stillness of her apartment, she could feel it. The weight of unseen eyes, watching, waiting. And the pocket watch. Its hands never stopped ticking. Backward. This is the Magician Horror Story number 3, The rain hammered against the city's streets, relentless and heavy, as the world outside blurred into a grayscale mess. Donna tugged her coat tighter around her shoulders, trying to block out the cold that gnawed at her skin. The chill in the air was nothing compared to the strange feeling creeping up her spine. She walked faster, her footsteps echoing in the emptiness of the alley. And then she saw it. A small, weathered sign swayed in the wind. Grimsby's Curiosities. The antique shop, tucked between two larger buildings, had always intrigued her, though she'd never dared to step inside. Tonight, though, there was something different, something pulling her toward it. She hesitated at the door for a moment, unsure. It was almost as though she could feel something waiting inside. Slowly, she pushed it open. The little bell above the door chimed softly, a reminder that, yes, she had just crossed into something unknown. The air inside smelled like dust, wood, and leather, old things, forgotten things. And it felt like stepping back in time. Shelves lined the walls, stacked with trinkets and objects, some faded with age, others covered in cobwebs. "Anything in particular you're looking for?" Donna jumped, startled by the voice that seemed to come from nowhere. She turned to see a man standing at the counter. His face was lined with age, but his eyes were sharp, too sharp. And when he smiled, it was unsettling. "No, just looking around," Donna replied, her voice soft, betraying the unease she tried to ignore. The man's eyes glinted. "Browse all you like. But remember, sometimes the best things find you, when you least expect it." Donna managed a half smile, but there was something about his tone, something in his gaze, that made her uneasy. Still, she couldn't resist the pull. She wandered further into the shop, moving past shelves of old books, tarnished silverware, and strange artifacts that seemed to whisper of another time. And then she saw it. A small wooden box, resting under a glass dome. It was simple, nothing grand, nothing ostentatious. Dark oak, worn with time, its brass hinges tarnished from years of neglect. But as Donna stood there staring at it, she felt an odd pull. Something about it called to her. She couldn't explain why, but she reached out, drawn by a strange magnetism. "That box," the man's voice came again, breaking her trance, "belonged to a magician. A man who could do things so extraordinary they've faded into legend. They say that box holds his most famous trick, a way to twist reality itself." Donna chuckled, nervous but curious. "Sounds like a good story." The man's smile didn't falter, but his eyes darkened. "It's no story, it's the truth. But magic like that, it comes with a price." The words hung in the air for a moment, heavy and cold. Donna, though, was already reaching into her pocket, pulling out her wallet. She didn't care. She didn't believe in magic, at least not in the way he meant. "How much?" she asked, barely able to mask the excitement that bubbled up in her chest. The man slid the box toward her, his fingers brushing against the worn wood. "It's yours." As Donna walked home, the box tucked securely under her arm, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The rain had stopped, but the air felt different. It was as though the city had taken on a strange, almost surreal quality. The people she passed seemed distant, their faces blurred, as if she was seeing them through a fog. Inside her apartment, she placed the box on the table, her hands trembling just slightly. She couldn't explain it, but she had a sense of anticipation building inside her. Her fingers hovered over the box, tracing the faded engravings on the surface. The brass latch caught the light as she carefully lifted it, and for a moment, time seemed to slow. Inside, there was nothing but a single sheet of yellowed parchment. The edges were frayed like it had been pulled out from a forgotten drawer decades ago. Her heart raced as she unfolded it, reading aloud, "Speak your desire, but beware the cost." She let out a breath, half amused, half uncomfortable. Was this some kind of joke? She glanced around the room, unsure whether to laugh or roll her eyes. But then, for some inexplicable reason, she found herself speaking. "I want something exciting," she said, a chuckle escaping her lips. "Something that'll shake up my life." She closed the box with a snap, dismissing the strange feeling that still lingered. "Well, that's that," she muttered to herself. But just as she turned to leave the table, she heard a faint creak, the unmistakable sound of the box moving. She turned, her heart thumping in her chest. The box was glowing, just faintly, but enough to catch her attention. The room felt colder now. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and then everything went still. Her breath hitched in her chest as she stood frozen, staring at the box in disbelief. What was happening? The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. Then, out of nowhere, she felt it. A cold gust of wind. A gust that should have been impossible inside her apartment. It whipped through the room, knocking over a lamp, sending it crashing to the floor. She rushed to the door, but it slammed shut before she could reach it. She tried the window, but it wouldn't open. The room, now plunged into darkness, seemed to close in around her. The box was glowing brighter now, the light pulsing rhythmically, like it was alive. The next morning, Donna couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. As she made her way to work, the city felt off, like a dream that wasn't quite her own. The streets were full of people, but they didn't seem real. They were too still, too perfect. And then, she saw him, a magician, on the street corner, performing tricks. His hands moved with fluid grace, and his eyes, when they met hers, were full of something otherworldly. He made eye contact with her, and it was like he knew her, knew everything about her. He smiled as if to say, "I've been waiting for you." "Step forward," his voice called out, beckoning her toward him. Donna's heart raced. She couldn't explain why, but she had to step into that circle. "You want excitement, don't you?" he asked, his tone full of dark amusement. Without thinking, she nodded. Then, the magician pulled out something from his pocket. The same box. The very same. That night, Donna opened the box again. The sheet of parchment had vanished. In its place was a single playing card, the Queen of Hearts. Her fingers trembled as she picked it up. And that's when everything around her shifted. The room seemed to blur. The walls twisted, distorted, and suddenly she was on a stage, an empty theater, bathed in shadow. She looked around in confusion, and there he was, the magician, standing in front of her, his eyes glinting like they knew something she didn't. "Welcome," he said, his voice echoing. "You wanted excitement. Well, here it is." Suddenly, the seats behind her filled with shadowy figures, their faces twisted in silent horror. The air turned thick, oppressive. "You're not in control," the magician's voice boomed, louder now, distorted, reverberating in the space around her. Panic surged in her chest as she turned to flee, but the stage stretched endlessly before her. She was trapped. The whispers started, soft at first, then louder, until they were deafening. "You can't leave," they whispered, the voices blending together into a cacophony. She reached for the box, but it had vanished. And then the magician appeared beside her. His smile was wide, cruel. "Magic always comes full circle," he said, his voice cold and final. Everything went dark. Donna was standing back in her apartment. The box was on the table. Nothing was changed, except the city outside the window. It was no longer the familiar street. It was something else, something wrong. And in that moment, Donna knew the price of her desire had been paid. Magic never gives without taking, and now there was no going back. Magic always comes full circle.